long before the lights learned his name, before the laughter curled through packed theaters and the music found its way into living rooms across America. Dean Martin existed in a world that didn't clap. It was a quieter world. A world of narrow streets and small kitchens, of early mornings that smelled like coffee and metal and damp coats. A world where talent did not guarantee survival, and dreams were often treated like luxuries meant for other people's children. Dean learned this early, not through speeches or lessons, but through watching the way adults moved when they thought no one was looking, the way shoulders sloped forward, the way laughter arrived late, if at all, the way hope, when it showed up, was kept small, like a candle cupped in both hands. His real name was Dino then, and in the neighborhood where he grew up. Names were not things you polished, they were things you carried. His father's hands were rough, permanently darkened by factory work. His mother sang while cooking, not because she thought she was good, but because silence felt heavier than sound. Money came and went like weather, unpredictable and rarely kind. Some weeks, dinner was generous. Other weeks it was creative, but music was always there, not as a fantasy. As a presence, it hummed in the background of his childhood like an unseen river. Old records. Half-remembered melodies. The way people softened when a song drifted through the room. Dean didn't know what he would become. He only knew how he felt when he sang steadier, somehow. As if something inside him found its proper shape, by his teenage years. He had already left school, already worked jobs that aged him faster than time. He boxed for a while. Worked in steel mills. Pumped gas. Jobs where hands mattered more than voice. Where silence was safer than sensitivity. But no matter how tired his body became, his mind kept wandering back to sound. To rhythm. To the strange power a voice could have over a room. So he sang where he could. Small clubs. Wedding halls. Back rooms where people talked through performances and clinked glasses louder than applause. He sang for tips, for meals, sometimes just for the feeling of being heard by someone other than himself. He sang not because he was confident, but because not singing felt like slowly disappearing. Those years carved something into him. Patience. There is a difference between waiting and enduring. Dean did not wait for opportunity. He endured the absence of it. He learned how to walk into rooms that did not care and leave them caring a little. He learned how to smile when he was paid late, how to thank people who dismissed him, how to stand in front of mirrors in cheap suits and still imagine stages he had never seen. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, rooms began to change. A club owner asked him back, "Hey." The crowd leaned in. A stranger stayed after a set to shake his hand. Nothing dramatic. No overnight miracle. Just momentum, the quiet kind. The kind that builds beneath the surface long before anyone notices waves. It was during one of those modest climbs that Elliot Crane entered his life. Elliot did not look like success, but he spoke like it. He was sharp where Dean was soft, precise where Dean was instinctive. He wore suits that seemed to arrive before he did. He talked about positioning and trajectory and leverage. Words that sounded powerful even when no one understood them. He had a talent for making rooms feel like meetings and conversations feel like contracts. He introduced himself as an agent, not the kind who boasted about connections, but the kind who implied them. He talked about circuits, about doors, about the way the business really works. Said he had been watching Dean, that he believed in him. That voices like his didn't come along often. Dean listened, not because he was naive, but because Elliot spoke to a hunger Dean had carried quietly for years. The hunger to stop surviving and start building. The hunger to know where he was going instead of simply moving. Their first real conversation happened after a late show. The club had nearly emptied. Chairs were upside down on tables. A janitor worked the floor in slow arcs. Dean was wiping down the small space he used as a dressing room when Elliot appeared in the doorway, clapping once, softly, as if applause were a private language. "You don't belong here," Elliot said. Dean smiled politely. He had heard that before from people who meant it kindly and from people who meant it cruelly. Elliot continued. "You belong somewhere people come to listen. Not drink over, He spoke about opportunities, about development, about shaping a career instead of hoping for one. He didn't promise fame. He promised movement, and after years of stillness, movement sounded like music. They started small. Elliot booked better rooms, negotiated slightly better pay, introduced Dean to people who looked at him differently, not as background sound, but as a possibility. He taught Dean about punctuality as branding, about consistency as currency. He encouraged him to change his name, to polish his presentation, to think of himself not just as a singer, but as a product the world hadn't met yet. Dino became Dean, and Dean began to rise. Not in headlines, but in steps. Bigger crowds. Warmer receptions. Invitations that came instead of being begged for. For the first time in his life, Dean felt something unfamiliar settling around him. Direction. Through it all. He remained himself. He remembered bartenders' names. He thanked stagehands. He signed autographs before anyone was asking for them. When a club owner's daughter asked shyly for a photo, he knelt so she wouldn't have to tilt the camera up. He tipped drivers. He listened when musicians talked. He treated attention not as entitlement, but as something fragile that could vanish if mishandled. Elliot noticed these things. At first he praised them. People like you, he said. That matters. But as months passed, something subtle shifted. The rooms grew larger. The contracts thicker. The stakes heavier. And with them, Elliot's language changed. He began to speak less about we and more about what I built. Less about Dean's voice and more about strategic development. When people complimented Dean, Elliot smiled as if they were praising architecture. It was never blatant. That was the danger. It appeared in small comments, in how he introduced Dean, in the way he answered questions directed at him, in the emphasis he placed on his role. Elliot didn't diminish Dean. He slowly relocated him, placing himself nearer the center of the story. Dean focused on performing, on improving, on staying grateful. Did not challenge it. He had spent his life fighting to get into rooms, not fighting over who arranged the chairs. He believed there was space for both of them. That success was not a pie to be guarded, but a table to be expanded. And for a while, it seemed true. Dean's voice found its audience. His ease on stage became a signature. He made people feel like they were in on a joke that wasn't cruel. He sang like conversation. He laughed like familiarity. He performed like someone who remembered what it felt like to sit in the dark. The applause grew, the venues changed, and with them, the pressure. Contracts now involve lawyers. Appearances involve negotiations. Money, once thin and precious, became a topic of structure, of percentages, of credit. It was after a particularly successful tour, one that left Dean exhausted, but quietly proud, that Elliot asked for a private meeting, not backstage, not over dinner in an office. The room was clean and bright, the kind of space that pretends to be neutral but always feels like it belongs to someone else. Framed posters on the walls. A desk too wide to feel conversational. Elliot arrived with papers, numbers, a new tone. He spoke about growth, about expansion, about how what they were doing now was no longer small scale. He spoke about how the brand was evolving, about how guidance at this level required a different kind of compensation. Dean listened. Then, Elliot slid the papers across the desk. He was asking for double his previous percentage, double his authority, double the recognition, not framed as a request. As an adjustment, I built this, Elliot said casually, and I can build it even bigger. But the structure needs to reflect reality. Dean didn't respond immediately, not because he was shocked, but because he was trying to understand something that wasn't numerical. He had always believed success was a shared ascent, but in Elliot's voice now, he heard something else. Ownership. Possession. A quiet rewriting of history, Elliot continued, filling the silence with justification. The rooms he had opened, the introductions he had made, the strategy he had applied. He spoke as if Dean were an instrument he had learned to play. And somewhere in the calm flood of those words, Something shifted inside. Dean, not anger, clarity. He looked at the papers, then he looked at the man who had once told him he didn't belong in small rooms, and for the first time since he had started this journey, Dean felt the applause fade, not from memory, but from meaning, because this moment was not about money. It was about story, who gets to tell it, who gets to own it, and who, in the end, stands in the light when the music stops. Dean folded his hands. He did not yet speak, but something was forming, something simple, something that did not need a contract to be true, and in the quiet space between breaths, the first shape of a sentence began to rise, a sentence that, in time, would be repeated far beyond that room, a sentence that would not defend him, but define him. Fame does not arrive like a door opening. It arrives like a ceiling lowering at first. Dean Martin welcomed everything that came with it. The schedules, the travel, the interviews, the expectations. He told himself this was the price of a dream fulfilled, the necessary exchange for having once sung into rooms that did not listen. He reminded himself of the nights he had carried his own microphone, of the days he had counted coins before buying lunch. Gratitude came easily to him. It always had. But as the months turned and the venues expanded, something subtle began to change. The applause no longer ended when he left the stage. It followed him into hotel hallways, into restaurants, into cars, into conversations that were supposed to be private. Everywhere he went, there was a version of him being discussed, projected, interpreted, sold. People didn't always ask what he thought anymore. They asked what he was going to do next. They didn't always want to know who he was. They wanted to know what he represented. And quietly, without ceremony, the music began to compete with the machinery around it. Elliot Crane thrived in that machinery where Dean saw people. Elliot saw patterns. Where Dean heard voices, Elliot tracked numbers. He started attending meetings Dean wasn't invited to, making calls Dean wasn't aware of, speaking on Dean's behalf before Dean had been asked. At first, Dean appreciated it. It felt like protection, like relief, like the burden of navigation had been lifted so he could focus on performing. But protection, when unexamined, can slowly become permission, and permission can quietly become replacement. Elliot's presence grew heavier, his opinions firmer, his language sharper. He began to speak less about what audiences felt and more about what markets demanded. Songs were no longer discussed for how they moved people, but for how they positioned the brand. Appearances were not weighed by connection, but by exposure. Dean noticed he was being talked about in rooms he wasn't in. Then decisions were being made in rooms he wasn't allowed into, when he questioned them gently. Elliot smiled and reassured him. "This is what growth looks like," he said. "You hired me so you wouldn't have to worry about this." But Dean hadn't hired him to disappear. He had hired him to move forward. The tension did not explode. It thickened like humidity before a storm. It lived in pauses, in unsentences, in the way Elliot began to correct Dean in front of others, subtly, as if to establish orientation. It lived in the way praise was redirected, how compliments aimed at Dean were reframed as successful strategy. The first real fracture came quietly. A journalist had approached Dean after a show, her notebook open, her eyes warm. She asked about his childhood, about the years before recognition. Dean spoke the way he always did when the past came up, carefully, respectfully, with gratitude for the people who had helped him, without ever shrinking himself. But the article, when it appeared, was not about his voice. It was about his management. It praised Elliot's vision, his construction, his architectural shaping of a raw asset. Dean was mentioned as talent. Yes, but framed like material. When Dean read it, he didn't feel insulted. He felt edited. He brought it up to Elliot later that night, not accusingly, but honestly. He spoke about how it felt, about how he didn't want the story of his life to become a footnote in someone else's narrative. Elliot listened, nodding slowly. Then he said, "Stories evolve. That's business." That word again, Business, Dean did not argue, but something inside him closed slightly. From then on, the weight of success became heavier than its joy, because joy could be shared, but weight isolates. People laughed with him, but fewer spoke to him. Meetings filled his days, but they did not feed him. Decisions piled up like mail he had not agreed to receive, and in every important discussion, Elliot's voice arrived before his. The tour that followed was the largest of Dean's life. The crowds were thunderous, the reviews generous, the contracts, by any external measure, triumphant. Internally, Dean had never felt more alone. He stood on stages larger than any he had imagined as a boy, and felt smaller on them than he ever had in back rooms. The performances were flawless, the atmosphere electric, but somewhere behind the lights, he could feel the distance growing between the man who sang and the man being sold. Each night, Elliot would greet him after the show with numbers, attendance, revenue, projections, rarely with questions, rarely with curiosity, and never with wonder. Dean tried to talk about the music, about moments he had felt from the stage, about a woman in the third row who had cried through an entire song, about a veteran who had waited 2 hours to thank him. Elliot smiled politely, then returned to logistics. There was always another meeting, another offer, another negotiation, until one evening. After a sold-out performance that left the crowd chanting his name, Elliot did not come backstage. Instead, a junior assistant appeared, nervous. With a message, Elliot was already at a meeting, a critical one, about future leverage. Dean sat alone in his dressing room that night, still in costume, still wearing the applause, still warm from the lights, and for the first time since his rise began, did not feel successful. He felt postponed. The hotel that night was quiet, too quiet for the magnitude of the evening. Dean stood at the window of his room, city lights below him like scattered constellations, and thought of the factory his father had worked in, of the kitchen where his mother had sung, of the small clubs where he had once been grateful for 5 people listening. He thought of the way Elliot had said, "I built this," and he asked himself a question he had been avoiding. What is this? A career or a person? The next morning, he asked Elliot to have breakfast with him. Not a meeting, breakfast. Elliot arrived late, his phone in hand, already mid-conversation. He ended the call without apology and began discussing upcoming contracts before sitting down. Dean waited, then said quietly, "Do you remember the first place you heard me sing?" Elliot paused, momentarily caught off script. "Of course. That club downtown? I saw potential." Dean nodded. "Do you remember what song I was singing?" Elliot hesitated. Dean smiled gently. "It mattered to me." Elliot waved it off. That was a different era. We're not there anymore. Something hardened behind that statement. A line. Dean leaned back in his chair. "We're always there," he said. "We just forget when it stops being useful." Elliot frowned, a crease forming between his brows. "You're sentimental today. That's fine. But we have serious growth happening, serious money moving, and serious people watching. This is the phase where control matters. Control, not care, not craft. Control. Elliot began talking about restructuring, about branding, about the necessity of aligning authority with impact. He spoke about his role expanding, about how what he had done deserved recalibration, about how the market recognized his influence. He did not mention Dean's voice. He mentioned the machine. Dean listened, and as Elliot spoke, pieces rearranged themselves. The private meetings, the redirected praise, the new language, the article, the contract revisions, the absence backstage. This was not ambition. This was authorship. Elliot was no longer managing a career. He was rewriting. Ownership. When the breakfast ended, Elliot stood, confident, already halfway back into momentum. "I'll send you the revised structure," he said. "Look it over. You'll see it's fair." Fair. Dean remained seated long after he left, because fairness depends on what story you believe you're in, and for the first time, Dean realized they were no longer in the same one. The papers arrived 2 days later. Double compensation. Expanded authority. Public credit language. Contractual acknowledgement of developmental origination. Elliot's name did not appear beside. Dean's it appeared above it. Dean did not tear the pages. He read them slowly. Then he folded them carefully, and in that quiet moment, something settled in him that had nothing to do with law. He did not feel anger. He felt separation, not from Elliot, from illusion, because he finally understood what was being asked. Not money, not partnership, but surrender. Of story, of identity, of authorship, and the sentence forming inside him. The one that had first stirred in that office weeks before. Now sharpened, it was no longer only instinct. It was ready. But before it could be spoken, the world would give him one more test, one more public stage, one more attempt to place a crown where a mirror belonged, and that stage was closer than he realized. The invitation arrived not by mail, but by announcement. A major industry foundation was hosting a televised tribute night, a celebration of voices that had shaped a generation, of performers whose presence had traveled further than their records. Dean Martin's name was printed at the top of the promotional poster in letters large enough to be seen from across the city. The event promised an evening of stories, live performances, reflections, and legacy. To the public, it looked like honor to Elliot Crane. It looked like opportunity. He called Dean the moment the invitation became public. His voice carried an excitement that felt different now, sharper, faster, edged with calculation. "This is perfect," he said. "This is the room," Dean asked quietly. "The room for what?" "For definition," Elliot replied. "For narrative. For setting the record straight about how this all came together." Dean did not answer immediately. The phrase lingered. Setting the record straight. That same week, Elliot arranged a sequence of interviews. Coordinated features. Backstage access to select reporters. He framed it as preparation, as control, as building the proper context before the event, and slowly, like water rising behind a door, the messaging shifted. Articles began to appear that spoke of strategic vision, of career architecture, behind-the-scenes genius. Dean was praised. Yes, but increasingly as execution rather than origin. His voice described as raw material, refined, his presence guided, success, engineered. Dean read every word. He said nothing, not because he agreed, because he was watching. He had learned something important in the years before fame. People reveal themselves most clearly when they believe momentum is on their side, when they think they are no longer auditioning, when they believe the story is already written. Elliot began requesting changes to the program schedule. He suggested he be included on stage to speak about the journey. He framed it as inspirational, as educational, as honoring the unseen labor behind visible success. The foundation hesitated, then agreed because Elliot was persuasive, because Dean was famous, because no one expected conflict from a man who sang like forgiveness. The night of the event arrived, dressed in elegance. The theater glowed like a held breath. Black suits, soft gowns. Cameras nested in balconies like quiet observers. The kind of evening where applause is pre-measured and gratitude is part of the lighting design. Dean stood backstage as technicians adjusted microphones. He watched monitors showing the audience filling their seats. He could hear the low orchestra of conversation swelling into anticipation. Someone handed him a glass of water. Someone else asked if he needed anything. He said no, because what he needed was already. Their clarity does not arrive loudly. It arrives like gravity, unavoidable, unarguable, quietly. Final dot. Elliot appeared beside him moments later, immaculate, confident, energized. He clasped Dean's shoulder, a gesture that once would have felt supportive. Now it felt like placement. "Tonight changes things," Elliot said. "After tonight, everyone will understand the full picture." On the night Dean met his eyes. "They already do." Elliot smiled thinly. Not completely. The show began. There were speeches, clips, tributes, performances. The audience responded generously, emotionally. Dean watched from the wings as colleagues spoke about music, about influence, about the way voices shape memory. He felt honored. He also felt distant, as if watching a version of himself he did not fully recognize then. His name was announced. The applause was immediate, thunderous, sincere. Dean walked onto the stage with the same steady pace he had always used, not because it was practiced, but because it was honest. He took in the crowd, the lights, the history folded into the room. For a moment, simply stood there, listening. Then he sang. In the theater. Shifted not because the song was loud, because it was intimate. People leaned forward. Shoulders softened. Conversations ended. It was the kind of performance that does not impress, it reaches. It reminds. It opens doors inside listeners they had not intended to visit. When the final note faded, there was a brief, sacred quiet. Then the applause returned. Louder than before, Dean nodded once, grateful, and stepped back. The host returned to the stage, speaking about journeys, about unseen architects, about the importance of recognizing those who build the bridges behind the art. Then he gestured toward the wings, and now, he said, the man who believed first, who shaped the vision, who helped guide this remarkable career, please welcome Elliot Crane. Elliot stepped into the light. The applause he received was respectful, curious, polite. He smiled broadly and began. He spoke well, he always had. He spoke about discovery, about potential, about the courage to see what others overlook. He spoke about long nights, difficult negotiations, strategic choices. He spoke about risk, about direction, about the necessity of firm guidance in unpredictable industries. Then he spoke about Dean, but not the way Dean spoke about Dean. He spoke about him like a result, as much as the world hears a voice. Elliot said it rarely sees the architecture behind it. Success is not an accident. It is assembled. He paused, letting the line land. He continued. Every stage, every contract, every opportunity that brought Dean Martin to where he stands tonight. These were not spontaneous. They were built, designed, executed. Somewhere in the audience, a few people nodded. Others shifted. Elliot went on, voice warming to its rhythm. I don't say this to diminish talent. I say this to clarify origin. Talent is potential. Structure is destiny. And destiny requires hands willing to shape it. He gestured gently toward the wings. Toward Dean, I believed in him. I invested in him. I took the raw and made it resonant. The applause that followed was uncertain. Not absent, but incomplete. Because something in the room had changed. Dean watched from off stage. He felt no embarrassment. No anger, only a narrowing, a focusing. Because in Elliot's words, he did not hear pride. He heard replacement. The speech ended. Elliot nodded, satisfied, and stepped aside. The host returned, thanking him warmly. Then, as planned, turned back toward Dean. And of course, he said none of this would exist without the voice itself. Please welcome back Dean Martin. The applause returned, stronger. More familiar? Dean stepped forward again. The lights met him. The room waited. He stood at the microphone, and for a long moment, he said nothing. Silence, when chosen, carries more authority than noise. People leaned in. The host glanced uncertainly. Elliot watched from the side. Arms folded, expression composed. Dean looked out at the audience then. Without shifting his tone, without raising his voice, he spoke, not to Elliot, to the room, to the story, to the air that had just been rewritten. I'm grateful, he began, for every person who's walked beside me, for every door opened, for every hand extended. He paused. But I need to say something clearly. The room tightened. When you build a house, Dean said, you don't take credit for the person who lives in it. A murmur moved through the audience. Dean continued slowly, deliberately. You don't tell their story for them. You don't breathe for them. And you don't own the reasons they learned to walk inside it. He turned slightly. Not dramatically, just enough to include Elliot in the same frame. There are people who help you find the road, Dean said. And there are people who try to become it. The air shifted. This was no longer tribute. This was boundary. Dean's voice remained calm. But music doesn't come from structure. It comes from somewhere you can't manage. Another pause. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, and the sentence he had been carrying. The one that had formed in silence, sharpened in clarity, and weighted through pressure, rose. 5 words. Not loud, not cruel, not defensive, but final words that would travel far. Beyond that room, words that would end an argument. Without continuing it, Dean leaned slightly closer to the microphone and spoke. The room was no longer a room. It was a held breath. Hundreds of people sat without moving, not because they were instructed to, but because something invisible had stepped between sound and silence. Cameras were still rolling. Lights still burned. But the air itself felt altered. As if it had been asked a question it could not ignore, Dean Martin stood at the microphone. He had just drawn a line without raising his voice. He had reminded the room that guidance is not ownership. That structure is not source. That help is not authorship. And now, in the fragile space between moments, everyone waited. Elliot Crane watched from the edge of the stage. He had come prepared for gratitude, for acknowledgement, for affirmation of influence. He had not prepared for refusal. He had not prepared for the idea that a story could resist being told by the wrong mouth. He smiled faintly, expecting Dean to soften, to pivot. To dilute, Dean did not. He looked once more at the audience. Then he leaned a little, closer to the microphone, not dramatically, intimately, and he said, You didn't make my voice. 5 words, no accusation, no insult, no spectacle, just truth. And truth, when spoken without anger, has a different gravity. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then something spread, not noise, recognition, a ripple through posture. Through expression, through attention. People did not cheer immediately. They absorbed. They turned the sentence over in themselves. They felt the difference between success claimed and self. Claimed you didn't make my voice, not rejection, placement, not. Denial of help, denial of ownership. Dean straightened. There are many people, he continued gently, who help you find stages, who arrange lights, who handle roads and rooms and doors, and I'm grateful to them. Paused. But a voice, he said, touching his chest lightly, comes from living, from losing, from waiting when no one is listening, from singing anyway. The silence deepened. People can support your journey, Dean said, but they cannot substitute for it. Only then did the applause begin, not thunder. At first it started in pockets, like rain finding ground. Then it spread, gathered, lifted. Not the applause of entertainment, but the applause of alignment. The sound of something being set back where it belonged. The host stood frozen, unsure whether to step forward or step back. Elliot had not moved. His expression had not collapsed. It had tightened, because the 5 words had done something no argument could. They had removed him from the center. Without pushing him, they had not embarrassed him. They had made him irrelevant. Dean did not wait for the applause to finish. He nodded once, respectfully, then turned and walked off stage. Not rushed, not triumphant, complete. Backstage, the atmosphere was different. Whispers replaced chatter. Technicians avoided eye contact, not out of discomfort, but out of awareness, as if they had witnessed something private and did not want to disturb it. A stagehand quietly offered Dean a towel he did not need. Someone else asked if he wanted water. He shook his head gently. He did not feel victorious. He felt light. Elliot arrived. Moments later. No audience. No lights, no script, just a hallway. A door, and the sound of applause muffled behind walls. That was unnecessary, Elliot said, keeping his voice low. You could have handled that privately. Dean looked at him. We tried privately, he said. You brought it public? Elliot exhaled sharply. You embarrassed me. Dean's answer was immediate. No. I stopped disappearing. They stood in silence. The applause beyond the wall surged again as another segment began. You're making a mistake, Elliot said. People will think you're ungrateful, difficult, emotional. Dean nodded once. Some will, then he added. The ones who matter won't. Elliot searched his face, as if looking for the old Dean, the compliant one, the grateful one. The one who listened while others spoke his story for him. He did not find him. What happens now? Elliot asked. Dean answered softly. Now we stop pretending we're building the same thing. They parted not with anger, but with finality, and finality is far more frightening to those who rely on negotiation. In the days that followed, the 5 words escaped the theater. They appeared in columns, in conversations, in studio hallways. You didn't make my voice. Some called it courageous. Some called it reckless. Some called it ungrateful. But many called it necessary. The industry reacted the way it always does when something genuine interrupts something convenient. With confusion, with fascination, with quiet recalculation. Several artists privately reached out to Dean, not to congratulate him, to thank him. They spoke about contracts they didn't understand, about names on projects that were not theirs, about voices softened to fit frameworks, about careers that had slowly become presentations instead of expressions. Dean listened, the way he always had. Elliot attempted to manage the aftermath. He gave interviews, clarified intentions, reframed. He spoke about collaboration, about misinterpretation, about pressure, but something had shifted, not publicly, structurally. People still took his calls, but they listened differently, because when a man claims to build voices, and one of those voices calmly says otherwise, the world does not forget. Weeks later, Dean stood alone in a smaller studio. No cameras, no foundation, no tribute, just musicians, just sound, just work. Sang not for legacy, not for narrative, for presence, for the same reason he had sung when only a bartender. Listened, and as his voice filled the room, he felt something he had not felt in a long time. Not success, belonging to himself. Because power is not volume, it is authorship. It is knowing the difference between guidance and identity, between support and substitution, between the house and the one who lives inside it. And long after contracts fade and headlines age, those 5 words remained, not because they were sharp, but because they were clean. You didn't make my voice. It's not a declaration of independence from others, a declaration of responsibility to self, and that is the kind of statement that never stops echoing.